It is 3:16 in the morning, October 25, 1944. Surigao Strait is so dark that a man cannot see his own hand in front of his face. Aboard the American battleship USS West Virginia, the bridge is pitch black. No searchlights. No stars. No moonlight breaking through the overcast. No human eye can find the enemy. But deep inside the ship, in a room bathed in a dull green glow, a tiny blip is crawling across a radar screen. 42,000 yards away. A battleship the size of a city block, invisible to every man on the ocean, is being tracked like a point on a graph. For half an hour, the guns do not move. Then, silently, the massive 16-inch barrels begin to rotate into the darkness. At 22,000 yards, they fire. The first blind salvo of the battle tears through the night and lands a mathematically perfect hit. That single shot did not just sink a ship. It buried an entire way of war. And it raises a question that has haunted naval historians ever since. How does a navy that spent 20 years perfecting the art of the night ambush become the helpless victim of an enemy it cannot even see? Stay with me. Because the answer is not what you expect. And it is not about luck. The fleet on the receiving end of that salvo was the Imperial Japanese Navy. In 1942, it was the most feared night fighting force on Earth. For the Allies, the words Japanese surface force approaching after dark were practically a death sentence. Darkness was not an obstacle for Japan. It was their most devastating weapon. Now, understand something important before we go any further. This is not a story about a lucky shot. It is not even really a story about a single battle. It is a story about two hidden machines, one built from human eyes, one built from glowing screens, and the night those two machines finally collided. The Japanese had spent a generation mastering the dark. The Americans had spent 2 years making the dark irrelevant. And here is the part that makes this story genuinely uncomfortable to think about. The Japanese did not lose because they were weak. They did not lose because they were unprepared. They lost because they were perfectly prepared for the wrong kind of battle. Everything they had spent 20 years building was real. It was brilliant. It was deadly. And it was obsolete before the first shell ever fell. So how did the masters of the night become the blind? How did a navy that could see in the dark better than any force in history sail straight into a slaughter it could not perceive? The answer does not begin on the night of October 25, 1944. It begins decades before the war, at a drafting table in Tokyo, where a handful of officers stared at a map of the Pacific and saw a future that terrified them. Hold that image. Because by the time we reach the end of this story, that drafting table, that doctrine, and the 20 years of brutal sacrifice built on top of it will all have been reduced to a single green blip on a screen in a windowless room. Let us rewind. To understand why Japan chose the night as its ultimate battlefield, you have to understand where the Imperial Japanese Navy came from and the single event that shaped everything it believed about war. Go back to 1905. The Russo-Japanese War. A young, ambitious Japanese empire had just shocked the world by defeating the Russian Empire, a European giant, in a war fought largely at sea. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo Heihachiro destroyed the Russian Baltic fleet in a single, overwhelming engagement. The Japanese called it the decisive battle. And it worked. That victory planted a seed in the Japanese naval mind that would grow for 40 years. The belief that a single, climactic, crushing naval battle could decide the fate of an entire war. That a smaller, smarter, better-trained navy could defeat a larger one through superior tactics, superior spirit, and perfect timing. Tsushima was not just a victory. It was a religion. To understand why Tsushima mattered so much, you have to understand what it looked like from Japan's side. Here was a nation that, 50 years earlier, had been a closed, isolated society with no modern navy at all. In a single generation, it had built a fleet trained a professional officer corps, and then defeated one of the great European empires in a war fought largely at sea. The lesson Japan took from that triumph was not complicated. A smaller force, perfectly trained and perfectly timed, could destroy a larger one. And the corollary was even more important: the war could be won in a single, climactic battle. That belief, born in the smoke of Tsushima, would shape every ship Japan built, every officer it promoted, and every plan it wrote for the next 4 decades. You cannot understand the night fighting doctrine without understanding this. The Japanese did not build their navy to fight a long war of exhaustion. They built it to win one perfect battle. Now fast forward to after the First World War. The great powers gathered and carved up the oceans with treaties. Japan, an island empire with ambitions far larger than its resources, signed on. And Japanese naval planners immediately understood what those treaties meant. Look at the mathematics they were staring at. The United States was an industrial titan. American shipyards could lay down keels faster than Japan could ever hope to match. American factories could produce steel, engines, guns, and ammunition in quantities that Japan could not dream of replicating. And the treaties, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, the London treaties that followed, legally locked the Japanese fleet to a fraction of American and British strength. In a straight daylight slugging match, raw numbers would eventually crush them. The Japanese knew this with absolute certainty. They could not win a war of attrition. Every honest planner in Tokyo accepted that fact. The treaty ratios were brutal and specific. For every 5 battleships the Americans and British could build, Japan was allowed 3. For every 10 heavy cruisers the Americans laid down, Japan was permitted 6. The numbers were not just humiliating, they were, in Japanese eyes, a permanent sentence of inferiority. And there was nothing Japan could do about it. It could not outbuild the American industrial machine. It could not outspend the American treasury. It could not even hope to out-recruit the American population. So the planners in Tokyo did the only thing a smaller navy can do: they looked for an edge that had nothing to do with numbers. They looked for a way to make the American advantage in ships and steel irrelevant. And the answer they found, in the end, was not a bigger ship or a bigger gun. It was the night itself. So they made a decision that would define their navy for the next 2 decades. They would not try to match American numbers. They would design a completely different kind of war. The doctrine they engineered had a name: Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. And it was built on a single, elegant assumption. The American Pacific Fleet, the reasoning went, would inevitably steam westward across the ocean to relieve the Philippines or to attack the Japanese home islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy would not meet them head-on immediately. Instead, they would subject that advancing armada to a relentless, grinding campaign of attrition. Submarines and land-based aircraft would chip away at the edges of the fleet during the day. But the true bleeding would happen after the sun went down. Heavy cruisers and fast destroyer squadrons would launch coordinated, high-speed strikes under the cover of darkness. The goal was to systematically whittle down the American numbers, stripping away their protective screens, crippling their capital ships, until the odds were finally even out. Only then, when the American fleet was exhausted and bleeding, would the Japanese battleships emerge for the final daylight annihilation. Now, stop and feel the weight of that vision. In this grand strategic plan, fighting at night was not an exotic emergency tactic reserved for desperate situations. It was the very core of their naval identity. It was the great equalizer. Darkness naturally neutralizes numerical superiority. A massive formation, heavy armor, overwhelming firepower, all of it becomes irrelevant if you cannot see who is shooting at you. But there was a problem hiding inside that beautiful logic. Operating a fleet of fast-moving warships at 30 knots in pitch-black conditions, without turning on a single searchlight, without broadcasting a single radio signal, is incredibly dangerous. It requires a level of seamanship and coordination that borders on the impossible. Ships collide. Formations scatter. Men get lost in the void. The Imperial Japanese Navy dedicated 20 years to mastering this impossibility. And that is the part of the story most people never hear. The night fighting empire was not born in a single flash of genius. It was built in blood, in peacetime exercises where sailors died so that the maneuvers could be perfected. Think about what that actually meant in human terms. The Japanese Navy was asking its men to do something no other navy had ever seriously attempted, to fight at full speed, in total darkness, in a coordinated fleet formation, without lights, without radio, without any of the tools that made night navigation safe. Every year, the fleet gathered for massive night exercises. Every year, ships collided. Every year, men died. And every year, the survivors got better. The Japanese accepted these losses because they believed the alternative was worse, that a navy which could not fight at night would be destroyed in a matter of months by the American industrial machine. They were not wrong about the threat. They were wrong about the solution. They spent 20 years perfecting a weapon that the enemy would eventually render irrelevant, not by matching it, but by making it meaningless. And that is the tragedy at the heart of this entire story. The most disciplined, most dedicated, most brilliant night fighting force in history was not defeated. It was simply outgrown. This is the foundation we are standing on. Now we have to understand the machine they built on top of it. Because the doctrine was only the beginning. The real weapon, the hidden lever that made the whole system terrifying, was still being designed in secret. The training regime the Japanese Navy built was notorious even inside Japan. Recruits were pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. Night exercises were run in the worst weather the Pacific could produce, zero visibility, towering seas, driving rain. And they were run at full speed because the doctrine demanded that a Japanese force be able to strike fast, strike hard, and vanish before anyone could react. Collisions during these massive nighttime fleet exercises were not uncommon. Ships would misjudge a turn in the blackness and slam into each other. Men were lost overboard in the dark and never recovered. Sailors died in peacetime just to perfect the maneuvers. The Japanese Navy accepted those deaths as the price of excellence. And the excellence was real. At the center of this entire doctrine was the human eye. The Japanese Navy scoured its ranks for men with exceptional natural night vision, testing thousands of sailors to find the few whose eyes could pierce darkness better than anyone else's. These men were selected for elite training as lookouts. They were equipped with massive specialized binoculars containing oversized lenses designed to gather every available photon of ambient starlight. A highly trained Japanese lookout standing on the bridge of a cruiser could spot the faint gray silhouette of an enemy warship against the dark horizon miles before an average sailor would see anything but black water. They trained to recognize the specific masted structures and funnels of American warships in the dark, identifying targets purely by their shadows. A Japanese lookout could look at a barely visible shape and tell you not just that it was a ship, but what kind of ship, what class, even which individual vessel it was, by the silhouette alone. This was not a trick. It was a system. An entire navy had been organized around a single, terrifying idea that the human eye, trained to its absolute limit, could turn darkness from a liability into a weapon. But here is where the story takes its first sharp turn. Seeing the enemy first was only half the equation. To truly exploit the darkness, the Japanese needed a weapon that could strike a lethal blow before the enemy even realized they were under attack. They needed a weapon that could cross miles of dark water without giving away the position of the ship that fired it. The solution to this engineering challenge became the most closely guarded secret in the Imperial Japanese Navy. And it changed the balance of power in the Pacific before a single shot of the war was fired. The weapon was called the Type 93 torpedo. The Allies would later give it a nickname that captured its terrifying reach, the Long Lance. To understand why the Long Lance was revolutionary, you have to understand what a torpedo was supposed to be in the 1930s. A conventional torpedo ran on a fuel that left a visible trail of bubbles and exhaust gas on the surface, a white wake that any lookout could spot from a mile away. It was slow. It had a short range. And it was dangerous to the ship that carried it because the wake pointed straight back at the launcher. The Japanese engineers who designed the Type 93 threw all of that away. They built a torpedo that ran on pure oxygen. Oxygen left no bubble wake. No trail of foam. No exhaust signature. A long lance fired into the night simply disappeared into the water, leaving nothing behind to betray its origin. And it was fast. It could cross the water at nearly 50 knots, faster than most destroyers could run. And it could strike from a range that seemed impossible. Where a conventional torpedo might be effective at a few thousand yards, the long lance could reach out across the horizon. Its warhead carried over 1,000 pounds of high explosive, more than enough to break the back of a heavy cruiser or tear open the hull of a battleship. Now, imagine being on a ship at night. You see nothing. You hear nothing. You have no idea an enemy is even in the area. Your radar, if you even have radar, shows nothing. And then, without any warning at all, the water around you erupts. That was the long lance. The perfect weapon for the perfect doctrine. A torpedo that could kill silently, invisibly, in the dark, from a range the enemy could not even imagine. There was, however, a dark secret hidden inside the long lance, and it tells you everything about how the Japanese thought. The pure oxygen that made the torpedo invisible also made it terrifyingly dangerous to its own crew. Oxygen and the fuels it burned could react violently, and a mishandled long lance could detonate aboard its own ship. Japanese crews lived with that danger every single day. They accepted the risk of blowing themselves up because the weapon was so valuable. And that willingness to accept catastrophic risk for the sake of the doctrine, that willingness to bet everything on a single, perfect, invisible strike, is the same mindset that would carry Nishimura into Surigao Strait. The long lance was not just a weapon. It was a philosophy. It said, we do not need to be stronger than you. We only need to be faster, quieter, and more willing to die than you are. For 2 years of war, that philosophy looked unbreakable. The Japanese did not just build this weapon. They built an entire tactical system around it. Their cruisers and destroyers were designed around the long lance. Their night training was built around launching it. Their entire doctrine of the decisive battle assumed that these invisible torpedoes would break the American battle line before a single main gun was ever fired. The long lance was the hidden lever of the whole Japanese system, the weapon that made the night fighting doctrine actually work. And for the first 2 years of the Pacific War, the system worked exactly as designed. The proof came on the night of August 8, 1942, in the waters north of Guadalcanal. A Japanese force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo slipped through the darkness and fell upon the Allied ships guarding the invasion of the Solomon Islands. The place was Savo Island. And what happened there would become one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of the United States Navy. Savo Island. A single night. For Allied cruisers, sunk in roughly half an hour. The American cruisers Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria. The Australian cruiser Canberra. All of them sent to the bottom in a devastating, one-sided massacre. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. The Allied sailors never saw the Japanese ships that killed them. The Japanese cruisers and destroyers appeared out of the darkness, launched their long lance torpedoes and their gunfire, and the Allied ship simply began to explode. The Quincy was hit so hard and so fast that her captain, mortally wounded, ordered the ship to ram the enemy, but he could not even see where the enemy was. The Japanese vanished back into the dark before a single coordinated Allied response could be organized. In half an hour, the Imperial Japanese Navy had demonstrated exactly what 20 years of night training had brought them. They had destroyed 4 Allied cruisers and damaged several more, for the loss of almost nothing. The night belonged to Japan. Completely. Absolutely. And here is the part of Savo Island that is so easy to miss. The Japanese victory was not just a military triumph. It was a confirmation of everything the Japanese believed about themselves. Their doctrine had been tested against a real enemy, in real combat, in the worst possible conditions, and it had worked beyond their wildest expectations. The lookouts had seen the enemy first. The long lances had struck without warning. The darkness had delivered the enemy into their hands. Every hour of training, every death in peacetime exercises, every drop of blood spent perfecting the night, it had all been worth it. From the Japanese perspective, Savo Island proved that their 20-year bet on the human eye and the invisible torpedo was correct. And that confidence, that absolute, earned, justified confidence, is exactly what made the disaster of Surigao Strait possible. Because a navy that is certain its doctrine is invincible does not look for a reason to doubt it. It does not ask the question that might have saved it: what if the enemy has stopped playing by our rules? Now, here is what the Japanese did not know on that night in August 1942. They had just handed the Americans the most valuable gift a rival can receive, a painful, undeniable, impossible to ignore proof that the old way of fighting was dead. Savo Island was a catastrophe for the Allies. But it was also a lesson. And the Americans, to their credit, learned it in a way that would ultimately destroy everything the Japanese had built. The Americans did not respond to Savo Island by training harder to see in the dark. They did not try to build better binoculars. They did not try to match the Japanese lookout for lookout. They did something far more radical. Something the Japanese never saw coming, because it did not look like a military response at all. And that decision, that single, quiet, unglamorous decision made in the aftermath of a humiliating defeat, is the hidden lever of this entire story. Everything the Japanese had spent 20 years perfecting was about to be rendered meaningless, not by a better version of their own skill, but by a completely different way of seeing the world. Hold that thought. Because now we have to understand how America built its machine. At the start of the Pacific War, the United States Navy had radar. But it was primitive. Early radar sets could detect that something was out there, somewhere in the dark. They could not tell you precisely where it was, how fast it was moving, or what it was. A radar contact at night was a vague, frustrating promise, a blip that said enemy nearby without saying where to shoot. The Japanese knew this. And for a time, they did not fear American radar at all. A Japanese admiral in 1942 could reasonably assume that even if the Americans had radar, it was not good enough to matter. The night still belonged to the side with the better eyes. Then the Americans did something that changed the entire equation. They did not just improve radar. They invented a completely new kind of radar, microwave radar. Where the old sets used long wavelengths that produce fuzzy, imprecise returns, the new microwave sets used short wavelengths that painted a sharp, continuous, almost photographic picture of the enemy. Through total darkness. Through rain. Through smoke. Through overcast skies. A Japanese battleship that was invisible to every human eye on the ocean was now visible as a crisp, precise target on a screen. But here is the part that the Japanese truly never understood, even at the end. Radar alone was not enough. The Americans understood something that the Japanese never did: information is useless if it cannot be shared. Think about how the Japanese fought. Their entire night system was built on individual excellence. A single brilliant lookout on a single ship spotted the enemy. That information lived and died with that one man, on that one ship, in that one moment. The Japanese had no way to fuse all of their eyes into a single picture. Every Japanese ship was fighting its own private war in the dark. The Americans built the opposite. They built the Combat Information Center, the CIC. A dark, windowless room deep inside the ship, where radar operators, radio men, and officers watched a single glowing picture of the entire battle. Every ship in the fleet fed its data into that room. Every ship drew its orders from that room. The American fleet stopped fighting as individual ships and started fighting as one organism with one set of eyes. Now, let that sink in, because this is the heart of the entire story. The Japanese had spent a generation training individual men to see in the dark. The Americans had built a room where the night simply ceased to exist. Not a better version of Japanese skill. Not more of the same. A fundamentally different way of waging war, one where the human eye, and everything built around it, was simply no longer needed. This was not an accident. It was the product of a painful learning curve. The Americans paid for this system in blood at Savo Island and in the brutal night battles that followed in the Solomons. Every defeat taught them something. Every lesson got wired into the machine. By 1944, the machine was complete. And the Japanese, still trusting their eyes and their doctrine, had no idea it existed. Let me give you a sense of how that learning curve worked, because it is the difference between a lucky navy and a dangerous one. After Savo Island, the Americans did not just mourn their dead. They tore the battle apart. They interviewed every survivor. They studied every radar plot. They asked the brutal questions: why did we not see them coming? Why did our ships fire on each other in the confusion? Why did the Japanese move through the night like ghosts while we stumbled? And the answers kept pointing to the same conclusion. The problem was not courage. It was not gunnery. It was information. The Americans had eyes, but every eye was on a different ship, looking in a different direction, reporting to a different commander. No single American officer had the whole picture. And without the whole picture, the night was a chaos where the Japanese moved freely and the Allies shot at shadows. The solution was organizational as much as technological. Radar gave the Americans the raw data. But the Combat Information Center gave them the ability to turn that data into a shared, continuous, actionable picture. A CIC was not just a room full of machines. It was a way of thinking. It centralized command. It fused information. It made the entire fleet see with one set of eyes. The Japanese never built anything like it. Their night system remained a collection of brilliant individuals, each fighting alone. And that difference, the difference between individual brilliance and shared intelligence, is the exact reason the masters of the night became the blind. There is one more piece of the American machine that deserves attention, because it is the final link in the chain. Radar could see the enemy. The CIC could share the picture. But somebody still had to turn that picture into a killing solution, and do it fast enough, and precisely enough, to matter. The answer was fire control. The Americans had been working on mechanical and electrical fire control computers for years, analog machines that could take the radar data, factor in the motion of both ships, the wind, the temperature, even the curvature of the Earth, and calculate exactly where the shells needed to be in the sky when the enemy arrived there. These machines did not just aim guns. They removed the human hand from the most delicate part of the kill. By 1944, that whole chain, radar to see, CIC to share, fire control to aim, was seamless. A Japanese ship could be destroyed without a single American eye ever resting on it. The machine was not a collection of parts. It was a single, integrated instrument of death. And it was about to be tested for the first time against the very navy that had inspired its creation. And here is the part that the Japanese never fully grasped, even at the end. They saw the American radar as a gadget, a useful tool, perhaps, but just another piece of equipment. They did not understand that radar was not the real revolution. The real revolution was the system around it. A single radar set was a toy. A radar set wired into a combat information center, fed by 100 sources, connected to fire control computers, and driving the guns of an entire battle line. That was a new kind of warfare entirely. The Japanese had a doctrine. The Americans had a system. And a doctrine, no matter how brilliant, cannot survive contact with a system that has made the doctrine's core assumption meaningless. The Japanese doctrine assumed darkness was a weapon. The American system made darkness irrelevant. That was the entire war, compressed into a single night. The situation for Japan is desperate. The American war machine has rolled across the Pacific. The Philippines, the prize that the entire Kantai-Quezon doctrine was built around, is being invaded. The Japanese High Command has staked everything on one final, all-or-nothing gamble: throw every remaining ship at the American invasion fleet and shatter it in one blow. The plan is called Show Go, and it is the last roll of the dice for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The southern arm of that gamble is a force commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. His command is a collection of aging ships and worn-out crews. The battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, both old, both outclassed. The heavy cruiser Mogami. A handful of destroyers. This is not the gleaming night fighting fleet of 1942. This is what is left of it. Nishimura's mission is to push his force through Surigao Strait, a narrow waterway between the islands of the southern Philippines, and fall upon the American invasion fleet from the south. He has no air cover. The skies belong to American aircraft. He is drastically outnumbered. The American fleet waiting for him is larger, newer, and better equipped. He has no element of surprise. The Americans know he is coming. By every conventional measure of warfare, Nishimura's mission is a suicide run. But here is the thing. Nishimura does not expect to survive. He is a career officer of the old school, and he sails into that strait knowing he will likely never come back. What he expects is something else entirely. He expects a brutal, traditional night action, the kind of fight where Japanese training extracts a massive, bloody toll from the enemy before the Japanese ships go down. He expects to sell his life, and the lives of his crews, at a price so terrible that it cripples the American fleet. And why would he expect that? Because the night is profoundly dark. Overcast. Threatening rain. The exact kind of blackness where Japanese lookouts had traditionally spotted American silhouettes first. The exact kind of blackness where the long lance had traditionally broken American battle lines before a single main gun was fired. In Nishimura's mind, the darkness is his ally. It is the one environment where history says he still holds the advantage. He sails into the midnight hours expecting to unleash the same brutal massacre that had broken Allied squadrons during the early days of the war. And here is the cruelest part of the irony. Nishimura is not a fool. He is not incompetent. He is exactly the kind of officer the Japanese system was designed to produce: brave, disciplined, loyal, and utterly convinced that the doctrine he had spent his entire career mastering would carry him through the night. He is a man fighting the war he was trained to fight. The problem is that the war has already changed. Let me make sure you feel the weight of what Nishimura is walking into. He believes he is entering the kind of battle his navy has won 100 times in training and a dozen times in combat. He believes the darkness is his shield and his weapon. He believes that even if he dies, his ships will take a terrible toll on the Americans before they go down. Every instinct, every lesson, every memory of his service tells him the night belongs to him. The Americans, waiting in the strait, are about to prove that the night belongs to no one anymore. It belongs to a green screen in a dark room. The cruelest irony is that Nishimura's flagship, the Yamashiro, was herself a symbol of everything that was about to die. She had been built in the era of the great battleship, a time when the world believed that the biggest guns and the thickest armor would decide the fate of nations. She had been modernized, but she was still a ship of the old world, crewed by men of the old world, commanded by an admiral of the old world. And she was sailing into a battle that the old world could no longer win. In a sense, the Yamashiro was not just Nishimura's flagship. She was the last argument for an entire way of war, and Surigao Strait was about to answer that argument with fire. Here is the trap that Nishimura cannot see, because he is still fighting the war of 1942. Surigao Strait is not an open ocean. It is a funnel. A narrow corridor of water, bounded by islands and shoals, running roughly north to south. Nishimura cannot maneuver freely. He cannot feint, cannot scatter, cannot use the vastness of the sea to his advantage. He is forced to drive his column essentially straight up a defined channel, a channel that the American commander, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, has had time to prepare with mathematical care. Oldendorf has layered his defenses along that corridor like a set of locked doors. And each door is deadlier than the last. The first layer is almost insulting. Small, wooden PT boats, motor torpedo boats, barely more than fast launches, swarm the southern approaches to the strait. As the Japanese column pushes northward, these PT boats attack. They fire their torpedoes. They miss. They are easily chased off or damaged by the heavy guns of the Japanese destroyers. From Nishimura's bridge, it looks like a nuisance. A frantic, ineffective American skirmish line, quickly brushed aside by the heavy armor of the Yamashiro. He probably smiles at the arrogance of it. Sending toy boats against battleships. But the PT boats were never there to sink battleships. They were there to build a picture. Every time a PT boat spots a massive silhouette, every time it is forced to retreat, its radio man immediately broadcasts the exact coordinates, course, and speed of the Japanese formation into the American network. Those reports flow directly into the combat information centers waiting further up the strait. Nishimura's ships are running dark, invisible to every human eye on the water. Yet mathematically, they are brilliantly illuminated. They are already trapped on the plotting boards of the American fleet. The PT boats have accomplished something far deadlier than a torpedo hit. They have stripped away the very foundation of the Japanese night advantage before the main battle even begins. The darkness no longer belongs to Nishimura. It never did. Think about the elegance of that move, because it is the signature of the entire American system. The PT boats did not need to sink anything. They did not need to win anything. They only needed to see, and to talk. In the Japanese system, seeing was the end of the chain. A lookout saw, a commander decided, a torpedo fired. In the American system, seeing was only the beginning. A PT boat saw, a radio broadcast the position, a CIC plotted it, a destroyer launched, a battleship finished the job. The information did not stop at the man who saw it. It flowed through the entire fleet like blood through a body. That is the difference between a weapon and a system, and it is the difference between the Navy that owned the night and the Navy that made the night meaningless. Now comes the second layer. And this is where the horror of the new American doctrine truly reveals itself. American destroyer squadrons, not the hesitant, tightly tethered destroyers of 1942 that had been slaughtered at Savo Island, but a new breed that has internalized every painful lesson of the early war, move into the strait. Using the continuous flow of radar data and PT boat reports, they do not blindly charge the center of the Japanese column. They split up. They use the dark coastlines of the strait to mask their approach. And they slide perfectly down the flanks of the advancing Japanese formation. Inside the combat information centers of the American destroyers, radar operators watch the glowing returns of the Fuso and the Yamashiro drift steadily into range. The American commanders do not need to wait for a lookout to yell a warning. They do not need to illuminate the Japanese ships with searchlights. They do not need to see anything at all. At 3 in the morning, from both sides of the strait, the American destroyers launch massive, synchronized spreads of torpedoes. Then they turn away and vanish into the darkness. No deck guns. No muzzle flashes. No warning. Just the weapons running their deadly mathematics in the dark. Think about what that moment meant for the men on the receiving end. On the Japanese ships, the night was still silent. The sea was still black. The lookouts were still staring into a void that showed them nothing. There was no flash of gunfire, no roar of approaching aircraft, no visible enemy anywhere in the world. And yet, without any warning, their ships began to die. A destroyer that had been steaming in perfect formation 1 second was a burning wreck the next. That is the true horror of the new American doctrine. It did not announce itself. It simply erased ships from the night, one by one, while the survivors searched the darkness for an enemy that existed only as a blip on a screen miles away. The Japanese destroyer Yamagumo is hit. Her magazines detonate, ripping the ship apart in a blinding flash. The destroyer Michishio is struck and crippled. Asagumo is hit, her bow torn away. The battleship Fuso takes a devastating torpedo hit, loses speed, and falls out of formation as fires break out below decks. Even the flagship Yamashiro is hit. Now, stop and consider the Fuso for a moment, because her fate is a small tragedy inside a larger one. The Fuso was one of the oldest battleships in the Japanese fleet, a ship built in the era when Japan's night-fighting doctrine was still being invented. She had been modernized, rebuilt, and pressed into service because Japan had run out of modern ships. And now, in the darkness of Surigao Strait, she was being torn apart by an enemy she could not see. Her crew never got a chance to use the skills their navy had spent 20 years perfecting. The torpedo that broke her back did not come from a visible enemy line. It came from the void. It came from a firing solution calculated in a windowless room, transmitted to a destroyer that had slid silently down the coast, launched, and vanished before a single Japanese eye could register its presence. And here is the most terrifying part of all. The Japanese have barely fired a shot in return. They have been fed into a meat grinder by an enemy they cannot even spot. Their lookouts, the finest night eyes ever trained, stare into the blackness and see nothing. Their long line, but the physical destruction is only the first layer of the nightmare. Because the Japanese operation is tearing itself apart from the inside. A second Japanese force, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, is pushing up the same strait behind Nishimura, completely separate, maintaining strict radio silence, with no integrated command. While the Americans pass targeting data seamlessly from PT boats to destroyers to battleships, the Japanese admirals are sailing in separate realities, unable to coordinate even with each other. In the smoke-filled darkness, Shima's flagship, the heavy cruiser Nochi, collides with the crippled, retreating cruiser Mogami. The Japanese are crashing their own heavy cruisers into each other in the dark. The force that once moved through the night like a single, coordinated instrument of destruction is now a disorganized, bleeding, colliding mess. And still, Nishimura refuses to turn back. The battered Yamashiro pushes north, bleeding speed, alone, into the teeth of the trap. Waiting at the northern exit of the strait is the American battle line. 6 battleships, arranged in a horizontal line across the mouth of the funnel, the classic formation of a navy that intends to cross the enemy's T. And here is the detail that gives this entire story its emotional weight. 5 of those 6 battleships, the West Virginia, the Maryland, the Tennessee, the California, and the Pennsylvania, had been resting in the mud of Pearl Harbor less than 3 years earlier, shattered and burning, destroyed by Japanese bombers on the morning of December 7, 1941. Think about that. The ships that are about to destroy the Imperial Japanese Navy's last battle force are the very ships Japan thought it had killed at the start of the war. The Japanese had sunk them in shallow water, written them off, and moved on. But the Americans did not abandon them. They raised them from the harbor floor, pumped out the mud, rebuilt them, and this is the part that matters, they did not just restore them. They gutted them and rebuilt them around the new technology. Ships like the West Virginia were fitted with the most advanced fire control radar of the era, the Mark 8 system, a radar so precise it could lock onto a target and track it with mechanical perfection, feeding a continuous stream of data to the guns. The old dreadnoughts of Pearl Harbor had been reborn as the most lethal instruments of the new age of electronic warfare. They were not just revenge. They were proof that the old world had ended. Now, the stage is set. The Yamashiro, battered and alone, is pushing north into the funnel. The American battle line waits in the darkness at the top. And deep inside the West Virginia, in a compartment bathed in green light, the radar operators are watching. 24 miles away, the Yamashiro appears on the screen. At 42,000 yards, the Mark 8 locks on. For half an hour, there is no frantic shouting. No searchlight sweeps. No officers straining through rangefinders. Just a pulsing blip crawling across a screen and a firing solution being built with cold, mathematical precision. The Yamashiro is sailing into the apex of the ultimate naval maneuver, the crossing of the T. For decades, tacticians had dreamed of this geometry. A horizontal line of battleships firing full broadsides at a column that can only reply with its forward guns. It is the perfect ambush, the textbook kill. But historically, it required daylight, clear visibility, and impeccable timing. No commander had ever executed it in absolute darkness, guided entirely by machines. To appreciate what was about to happen, you have to understand what the crossing of the T meant to the men who had spent their careers dreaming of it. For a battleship admiral, it was the perfect kill, the moment when the geometry of the sea delivered the enemy into your guns. A column of ships, steaming north, could only bring their forward turrets to bear. A line of ships, waiting across their path, could bring every gun on every ship to bear at once. It was the difference between a man fighting with one arm and a man fighting with both. In the old world, the crossing of the T required daylight, perfect visibility, and an enemy obliging enough to sail into the trap. Oldendorf had all three of those things in a sense, except his daylight was a green radar screen, his visibility was a set of glowing blips, and his enemy was sailing into the trap because he could not see that it existed. Down in the plotting rooms of the American battleships, analog computers are calculating the firing solution. They factor in the target speed, the firing ship's speed, the wind, the temperature of the powder, even the rotation of the Earth. The solution is transmitted directly to the gun turrets. Without a single gunner ever seeing a silhouette, the 16-inch barrels elevate and rotate, tracking an invisible ghost across the sky. The West Virginia opens fire. Then the Tennessee. Then the California. 2,000-pound armor-piercing shells tear through the dark sky. And because the firing solution is built on continuous electronic data, not a fleeting optical estimate, the very first blind salvos begin ripping into the Yamashiro. On the receiving end, the nightmare is absolute. The Japanese crew is being torn apart by a hurricane of steel, and they still cannot see the ships killing them. The Yamashiro's gunners desperately return fire, reduced to shooting blindly at the distant muzzle flashes of the American broadsides. They are stripped of every tactical advantage they spent a generation perfecting. Their lookouts see nothing. Their long lances have nothing to aim at. Their entire doctrine, the 20 years of training, the elite eyes, the invisible torpedo, the mastery of the night, is worthless. They are no longer in a battle. They are the subjects of an automated, one-sided execution. The Yamashiro is hit again and again. Fires rage across her decks. Her superstructure is torn apart. And still she steams forward, into the teeth of the American line, because her admiral has ordered her north and the Japanese Navy does not retreat. She is a burning, dying monument to a doctrine that has already been rendered meaningless. Here is a detail that captures the tragedy of that night better than any statistic. The Yamashiro's crew, the men who had trained their whole lives to fight in the dark, were reduced to firing at the muzzle flashes of the American broadsides. That was all they had. Not radar. Not a firing solution. Not even a clear silhouette. Just the brief, distant flashes of light that marked where the enemy guns were. They aimed at flashes. They fired at flashes. And the flashes were 22,000 yards away, while the shells that were killing them were being guided by machines that did not need light at all. The masters of the night had been reduced to shooting at ghosts. Eventually, the Yamashiro, the flagship of Japan's last night fighting force, goes down, taking Nishimura and most of her crew with her. The Fuso has already been destroyed, broken apart in the dark. The Japanese southern force has ceased to exist. And the American battleships, the ghosts of Pearl Harbor, have fired their guns in anger for the last time in history. Because what happened in Surigao Strait that night was not just a battle. It was the end of an era. The last time in all of human history that battleships would clash directly with battleships. Historians often remember Surigao Strait as a milestone of nostalgia, the last great duel of the battleship age, the final time the old giants of the sea met in battle. And that is true. But its true weight is deeper and far more terrifying for the old masters of the sea. What died in Surigao Strait was not just ships and men. What died was darkness itself as a tactical weapon. For centuries, night had been the great equalizer of naval warfare. The side that could see in the dark, or the side that could hide in the dark, held a power that no amount of steel could match. The Japanese had understood this better than anyone in history. They had built an entire empire's military identity around it. And on the night of October 25, 1944, that power was stripped away forever. The slaughter in the strait proved something profound about the nature of combat itself. Human senses no longer dictated the terms of an engagement. A lookout with perfect night vision, a torpedo that left no wake, a doctrine built on individual excellence, none of it mattered against a fleet that watched the battle on a glowing screen in a windowless room. The tragedy of the Japanese fleet that night was not that it entered battle unprepared. It entered perfectly prepared for the wrong kind of night battle. 20 years of brutal training. Elite lookouts with oversized lenses. A torpedo that could kill without a trace. A doctrine that had terrified the Allies in 1942. All of it sailed into the strait, confident and proud, expecting to fight the war they had trained to win. The Japanese were fighting a war of shadows and silhouettes. The Americans had transformed the battlefield into a continuous, mathematically precise grid. The Japanese had spent a generation learning how to fight in the dark. The Americans had spent 2 years making darkness irrelevant. That is the real story of Surigao Strait. Not a battle between ships. A battle between two ways of seeing the world, and the moment one of them became obsolete. And there is one more layer to this story that deserves to be told, because it is the part that makes Surigao Strait feel inevitable in hindsight. The Japanese did not lose that night because they were unlucky. They lost because their entire way of war had been built on an assumption that was already false. They assumed that the human eye was the ultimate instrument of night combat. They assumed that individual excellence would always beat collective technology. They assumed that darkness would always be their ally. Every one of those assumptions was reasonable in 1930. Every one of them was fatal in 1944. The Americans did not defeat the Japanese doctrine. They simply made it irrelevant and then watched it sail, confident and proud, into a battle it could not possibly win. That is the most frightening lesson of Surigao Strait. The enemy does not always have to beat you. Sometimes the enemy only has to change the game. And if you are watching this in the modern world, you already know what that feels like. Every generation has a Surigao Strait. Every generation has a skill, a craft, a way of working that was once the ultimate advantage, and then one day, quietly, a machine made it irrelevant. The accountant replaced by spreadsheets. The craftsman replaced by automation. The experts replaced by algorithms. The lesson of this battle is not just about warships. It is about the terrifying speed with which mastery can become obsolete. And that is why this story matters so much, even to people who have never thought about battleships in their lives. Surigao Strait is not ancient history. It is a warning that repeats itself in every generation, in every field, in every industry. The best swordsman in the world is obsolete the moment the gun is invented. The best telegraph operator is obsolete the moment the telephone arrives. The best human calculator is obsolete the moment the computer switches on. The Japanese Navy was not defeated by a stronger version of itself. It was defeated by a different version of the world, a world where the skill it had spent 20 years perfecting simply did not matter anymore. And the men who sailed into Surigao Strait did not know that world existed. They died believing the night still belonged to them, when in truth the night had belonged to no one for 2 years. That is the real tragedy, and it is the reason this battle still has something to teach us. Not about ships. About the terrifying gap between what we are trained to see and what the world has already become. Think of how a 1942 night engagement began. An officer with massive binoculars spots a faint silhouette. A quiet torpedo order. The long lance glides silently toward surprised ships. The night is alive with danger, and the Japanese own it. Now look at Surigao. A Japanese lookout stares into the same pitch-black void and sees absolutely nothing. But miles away, deep inside the West Virginia, there is no need for searchlights. No need for daylight. No need for eyes at all. The bridge is completely black. Nobody has laid eyes on the Yamashiro. Yet the heavy guns rotate in eerie silence, and the firing solution is already locked. On the other side of the strait, the Japanese battleship steams forward, believing the night is still empty. The United States Navy did not learn to play by Japanese rules. They fundamentally rewrote them. Japan spent a generation learning how to fight in the dark. America spent 2 years making darkness irrelevant. And somewhere in that green glow, the era of the human eye ended, not with a bang a man could see coming, but with a blip on a screen, in a room where the night had ceased to exist. If this story made you feel something, that strange mix of awe and dread when an entire way of war dies in a single night, then you understand exactly what this channel is about. We do not just tell you what happened in history. We take you inside the machines, the decisions, and the hidden systems that changed everything, the moments when the old world became obsolete and a new one was born. If you want more stories like this, the hidden levers, the impossible reversals, the battles where the rules of war were rewritten, then hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Because the next video is already on the way, and it is about another empire that trained for decades to master a weapon, only to discover that the enemy had already made it useless. And if you made it this far, drop a comment. Tell me, what is the one skill you think could become obsolete in your lifetime? I read every single comment, and the best answers might just become the next video. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the world is not the one you can see. It is the one that makes everything you trained for irrelevant.